In this lecture, we're looking at Luther and politics. And there's a big reason to discuss this issue because while it might seem that politics is an issue that's on the periphery of Luther's Reformation, actually, when you get down into it, and you get into some of the legacy of Luther over the centuries, one of the most enduring places that he touched European history as well as German history is in his proclamations about the role of the church and the state, and on the subject of violence. Also, when we get later in this course and we begin to talk about Luther's view of Christians in society and the two kingdoms doctrine and all the things he has to say about the role of Christians in culture, all of these issues of Lutheran politics will come crashing back into the scene. And too often what happens is people begin to talk about Luther and the two kingdoms, or Luther and Christians and culture, and they leave behind all of the context and the places in which he spoke about politics and Christians and culture, and they talk about it in a vacuum. Well, not surprisingly, talking about a man and his theology out of the context in which it was fashioned is a recipe for disaster. And a lot of the issue here that is important sort of rests on two main planks here. First and foremost, in European politics, and in German history in particular, the role of Luther as a kind of man of the people, as a German man, particularly in the middle of the 1800s and all the way down until the Nazi Revolution, is frankly troubling. Now, I'm going to say at the outset that Luther certainly would not have wanted his name used in this way, but the fact remains is that it was. Sometime in the middle of the 1800s, Luther's name became synonymous with the rising German national sentiment that was to lead all the way into the 20th century and into the two world wars. There were plays done about Luther, songs. The intelligentsia, the leading elites of Germany in this time, began to use Luther as a symbol of nationalistic pride, and they began to leverage his legacy in an effort to stymie the church and hold it back from any critique of the changes in government and the new nationalistic policies that were underway. And this all comes to a head in 1933, in one of the most painful moments, frankly, in the history of the legacy of Luther, when just after the revolution of Hitler taking over the government, the German Evangelical Union, which is the largest and the most powerful voice of the German Protestant Church, not only backed the changes that Hitler brought about in Germany, but they cited Luther as the wellspring of the ideas that had come all the way down until their day. They actually issue a proclamation in which they say that what is built now is built on none other than Luther himself. And they pitch their inefficiency and their unwillingness to censure or change or challenge anything in government on the fact that they believed that Luther had nothing to say to the German princes who were over him. That in fact Luther was a nationalistic man who always backed the state. And so as Hitler's regime came on the rise and as it gained momentum, and even as the Holocaust was becoming more aware in Europe as the atrocities of World War II carried on, the German church, resting on this supposed legacy of Luther in the inaction of church in the role of politics, had a disastrous role to play in the German church's inefficiency to stand up or to challenge or to censure anything to do with Hitler's regime. Now, this is not a course on the 20th century or on the world wars, but one of the issues with the Reformation is often how it's used in the modern world. It's no surprise that a man with the power and the influence and the stature of Luther becomes useful, whether or not it's ahistorical or not, he becomes useful as a tool for change or a lack of change within certain sectors of church and state. The other factor, and it's more pervasive in evangelicalism and Protestantism, is a lack of clarity as to how the doctrine of justification or how the overall complex of salvation in the Lutheran Church shapes a Christian in their engagement with the world around it. And we're going to talk about this more explicitly again later in the course, but we're going to lay out the paradigm now so that we're at least aware of it when we look at Luther's context. It's unclear to some if the doctrine of justification, if the free grace of the gospel, either makes the world around us irrelevant, and therefore we become immune and somewhat insulated from the ongoing culture wars or from the political battles of the day, or if the doctrine of justification and grace empowers us to engage in those realms and in those sectors of the world around us. I can tell you that I've heard people argue with the same ferocity and the same conviction on both sides of that camp. I've also heard historians, at least at the popular level, people who love Luther, use him as a wedge or as a driving force for either side of this debate in the modern world. Oh, Luther, they say, he was so committed to justification that the issues of the culture wars or politics, whether secular or moral or whatever there might be, are now irrelevant. I've also heard people say, Luther, he got involved with politics, he rolled up his sleeves, he didn't allow the justification doctrines to simply make him a pietist, and therefore we too ought to do the same. Well, setting aside the theological issues in terms of their overall sweep, in terms of the impact and the influence of Luther in these areas, in this lecture we're going to be looking at how Luther actually engaged in the political world around him. Because again, it stands to reason that if we don't know what Luther actually did, and if we don't actually know his context, then later when we get to the issues and the doctrines surrounding his understanding of the two kingdoms or of the Christian in society, we're going to be altogether lost. Well, we can characterize Luther's teachings on politics and society by really one word: conflicted. That is to say, Luther is not unanimous. He does not have a single view or a single application of his views over time. This is vitally important because too often the impression people have of Luther comes from one quote they saw on Twitter or something like this, or one simple article that tries to piece together Luther's doctrine from one book. The fact of the matter is Luther adapted and changed his opinions on a couple of key areas depending on the circumstances. And that's okay, we do the same thing. There are times where our convictions about church and state, or our convictions about Christians and society, take on different tones based on different contexts. I think it stands to reason that if you and I lived in New York City, we might have a different application of some of these principles than if we lived, say, in the Sudan, where the persecution of Christians is intense and often. That is to say, I think Luther has a relatively singular opinion about politics and about Christians in society, but the application of those convictions changed somewhat over the course of his career. However, as we'll see here, there are a few cases where Luther is something of a hypocrite. Now, I don't mean that in the worst possible light. What I mean is, there are times where the circumstances overwhelm, and even Luther is prey to making bad decisions. Well, when we look at Luther in the Reformation and the issue of politics and society, there are really two issues that arise that always come to the forefront of any discussion during this time. And those two subjects are the role of the government in the church. How should politicians play a role? Should they play a role? These kinds of questions. And secondly, can a Christian ever respond with violence? Well, the first question is a difficult one for the modern world. We're much more used to a free state, a separation of church and state, and of a privatizing of our ethics. The idea that government or government employees ought to get involved, that they ought to do anything in the state that affects the church, or, at times, that they should try to do anything in the church at all, strikes us as a bit strange. But I always tell students, you have to flip this on its head in order to get the modern 20th century application of this. You see, in this day and age, the government did all kinds of things that we would consider to be, frankly, outside of their bounds. We saw this actually with the Diet of Worms. The fact that the state would get involved in the capital punishment of heretics is obviously something we do not want to see today. But if you flip that on its head, what you realize is in the modern world, you've had a relative restriction of the things that government is supposed to be in charge of, the things that it's supposed to govern. Well, there are all kinds of questions today in the 21st century, in the reverse, that ask the question, how much should Christians get involved in the government? You see, because apart from paying taxes, the government actually asks very little of us, at least in the North American environment. And so there's always the question in the 21st century, should Christians get involved in local, regional, state, or federal political issues? And I don't just mean voting, I mean really get involved. So I think if you take the reformational application of this, which is how should princes get involved in the church, and you flip it upside down, you get a modern application of this question, which is how much should Christians get involved in the political regimes of whatever world they're a part of. And you'll see that the answers are relatively applicable in both cases, whether it's us engaging with government or the government engaging with the church. So that is actually a relevant question in terms of Christians and society. The second question is a little more fundamental, though, and that is the question of, should Christians ever get involved in violence? All kinds of issues here. Can a Christian serve in the military? Can a Christian defend him or herself? And if so, are there any limits to that defense? What if you're in a totalitarian regime that is persecuting you, but the Christians have the majority numbers, and if they decided, could take up arms and overthrow the government? Is there any biblical justification for this? These kinds of questions are vitally important in Luther's day and, frankly, in our modern world. In the context of the Reformation, they're vital because what's going to come on the scene very, very quickly after Luther's death is a number of wars that beget further wars, that beget further wars, that eventually culminate in the wars of religion. And these wars of religion are some of the worst and nastiest and bloodiest that history has ever seen. Catholics attacking Protestants and vice versa. So there's an immediate application to the question, can Christians do violence? Well, it's also, frankly, a modern application in the 21st century. Perhaps not so much in the American context, but certainly in the global context. There are all kinds of regimes and all kinds of Christians who are living under regimes around the world where there's a natural question. If we have the numbers, if we have the capacity to overthrow this evil regime that is killing us, are we able to fight and do bloody violence in an effort to secure our own freedom? Doesn't Paul say in Romans 13 to fear the state? What grounds then do we have to do violence in order to protect ourselves? It's a fundamental problem, frankly, of Christians in the modern world, as well as in the Reformational world. So we're going to go through Luther's life, and we're going to look at a couple of places where either of these issues, or both, come to the surface so that we can get some context as to how Luther engages with these subjects. And then we can begin, frankly, right after the Reformation gets going. In 1520, Luther wrote his famous Address to the Christian Nobility. And this book is pretty telling in terms of Luther's understanding of the relationship between Christians and the political order. By 1520, you'll remember, Luther had become excommunicated, though he had not yet stood trial at the Diet of Worms. Well, Luther calls on the political regimes in this book to stand up and take the church back from the tyranny of the Pope. In fact, he refers to German princes as Notbischof, which translates to mean the emergency bishops. He calls on them in a moment of crisis to step in and reform the church, to remove recalcitrant and unwavering Catholics from their posts, and to place Protestants in the pastorate instead. He calls on them to outlaw the Mass, to end the sale of indulgences and penance, and all of these other things. So right out of the gate, Luther is championing and holding high this idea that Christians should call upon the political rulers of their day in order to effect change in their world, in this case, in the church. Now, it's this doctrine in particular that Luther will sort of shade and nuance throughout the rest of his life. It's also this doctrine, by the way, that many are appealing to later in the centuries when they appeal to Luther as the German national who supports the totalitarian regimes of Germany. Now, that's not what Luther has in mind here. Rather, what Luther has in mind is this idea that the Pope has abrogated his position as the head of the church, and therefore the emergency need for a quick reformation falls to the next best power, which is the power of the state. Now, it's hard to imagine anyone in the 21st century making an argument like this, at least not in the Western world, but the argument in Luther's day made a great deal of sense. Who else are you going to appeal to? There are no other processes. Everything has to be reformed. City governments will not enact change simply because the pastors want it. However, if the princes get involved and say, no, we need a reformation, then the cities would step in line and the churches would be reformed. It's a top-down societal formation that we don't simply have in the 21st century. And so it's a bit hard to understand in terms of our context. But what Luther is calling on here is, again, not so much that church and state become fused together. They already kind of were entangled to begin with. Rather, what he's calling on is the next best power, the next lowest power, frankly, to reform the church and to open the floodgates of reformation that Luther believed the German people wanted. So when you go to the first two questions that we asked on the subject of the Christian's role in the government or the government's role in the church, Luther begins right out of the gate in the 1520s with an affirmative, with a positive. And we can say, by and large, he's going to keep this position all the way to the end of his life. Now again, it's hard to gauge this because when Luther speaks positively of the role of politicians in the church, he's frankly only talking about the people that are supporting him. He's not referring to the princes in Catholic regions in this case. Rather, he's talking to people like Philip of Hesse and John of Saxony and the men that have the power to effect the change in their realm. Well, what about the issue of violence? Well, again, right out of the gate, Luther has to deal with the subject of Christians rising up to effect change through violence. And we saw this in 1525 with the rise of the Peasants' War. Luther wrote some very inflammatory tracts, the most important of which is on the murdering and thieving hordes of peasants, in which he says in unqualified terms that anyone who rises up in violence is a damnable soul and, frankly, subject to hellfire and damnation for doing this. You are usurping God's order, he's saying. There should be no violence amongst Christians, particularly not in the case of those who want societal change. Taking up arms is off the table. Well, this is important because often what happens is historians, and at least at the popular level, people stop right here. They see that Luther said, no violence, peasants, sit down, put down your arms, and stop fighting. And there has become this sort of urban legend or this popular misunderstanding that Luther always condemned violence. And so they stop at 1525, which is frankly over 20 years before he dies, and they kind of crystallize or freeze what they believe Luther's position is on the subject, based on what he says to the murdering and thieving hordes of German peasants. Well, the fact of the matter is this is one of the issues where Luther does change his mind. Because you see, for Luther, it's one thing for the peasants to rise up against the princes, but what about the issue of Protestant princes creating a sub-league within the Holy Roman Empire and mounting forces and either defending themselves against Charles V or taking the attack to Charles V? Now here's the thing. Based on the principles that Luther applies in 1525, that is a damnable heresy. These lesser princes are rising up and fighting against their masters. So why doesn't Luther write a book called On the Murdering and Thieving Hordes of German Princes? What about if these princes gang up together and go to war just in the same way? Well, on the issue of violence, Luther goes through a two-stage change in his opinions. First of all, in the issue of defending oneself. In 1526 and in 1530, somewhere in that range, a span of about 4 or 5 years, Luther shifts from an unalloyed, unwavering conviction that Christians do no violence, period, that it's not their role at any point, that the goal of the Christian is to suffer. That was his earliest position. Well, from 1526 to 1530, roughly, Luther begins to develop language in support of the princes of Germany, the Protestant princes, in which he alters the doctrine somewhat of violence. And he begins to take on actually a law not from the Bible, but from old Roman law, old canon law, in fact. And the history of this is complex, and I won't get into it now. But essentially there are some old rules in canon law that discuss, in a Latin phrase that's very sort of sloganeering, the right of someone to repel force with force. That is to say, this is the idea that if someone breaks into your house and they come with a gun, this doctrine, this idea of repelling force with force, means that you're able to repel the person with the same amount of force or violence that they're coming after you with. It's the rule of self-defense, frankly. So to keep that analogy going, if someone comes after you, you may do just enough force to stop them from attacking you or your family. What this doctrine does not allow, though, is if they turn and run, for you to chase them down, tackle them, and pummel them some more. And around this time, again, 1526 to 1530, Luther begins to take on this kind of language from canon law. He sort of takes this stray doctrine and he begins to incorporate it into his own teaching. Now, he does so for a very particular reason. which is that in 1526 there was formed the League of Torgau, and this was an initial band of the Protestant princes, Philip of Hesse and John of Saxony, for example, who were coming together to form a defense league. They were increasingly fearful that the Catholics were going to band together, and in particular with Charles V, and that they were going to come after these German lands and attack them and reimpose Catholicism. And so the League of Torgau comes together, and they need Luther's blessing on this. And Luther says, essentially, if they attack you, you may repel force with force. Now, in this case, Luther is talking about the state, but this is an application that Luther also gives to the Christian in general. He doesn't explain it in great detail, but the idea here is that someone can self-defend, that this is not doing violence or attacking someone. And that doctrine, this idea of repelling force with force, is crystallized and formed in full by 1530 or 1531, because, despite the fact that the League of Torgau came together in name, it actually had very little impact on the history of Protestantism or on the politics of Europe. The League of Torgau had no standing army, it mustered no troops, and the threat of Catholic invasion was nothing more than a threat. In 1530, though, as the new decade dawned, there was increasing rumblings from the Catholic princes that they were going to come in and reimpose Catholicism. Now, just to give you the punchline on this, in 1547 and 48, after Luther's death, Charles V and the Catholic army do come and reimpose Catholicism for a short span of time. They whip the Lutherans, they defeat them, and they impose something called the Augsburg Interim. Now, Luther is dead by this point, but Melanchthon and others take the brunt of this because what's reimposed on Lutheran areas is Catholicism in this later date. So here in 1530, there is a real threat and a real concern. These aren't just empty threats. In the span of about 15 years, these threats will actually come to fruition. So there is real fear. Well, in 1530 and 1531, what is being formed is what we call today the League of Schmakaldic. And this is really the culmination of where the League of Torgau intended to go. And the League of Schmakaldic is a band of Protestant princes with a standing army. They had about 12,000 troops, 10,000 infantrymen, and about 2,000 soldiers on horseback. So they had a standing army of defense. And in fact, it was Luther's understanding of violence, his change to the idea of defense, that allows this to happen. Luther is very much supportive of the Protestant League of Schmakaldic. In fact, in 1537, Luther himself writes a set of articles or a short confession called the Schmakaldic Articles. And these were to serve as a confessional backbone to this new Protestant League as it attempted to wage war against Catholic princes and ultimately against Charles V. Now, these articles were never accepted. It never got quite that far. But Luther's involvement with an army, with a usurping army in some ways, armies that frankly were out of step and defiant against Charles V's will that Catholicism be reimposed. Luther's involvement with this muddies the water, frankly, of this age-old view that Luther always believed that violence was evil. Here, Luther himself is in bed with the politicians who are attempting to usurp the authorities. And in fact, over the course of the 1530s, Luther eventually adopts not just a defensive posture of violence, but rather a doctrine of preventative attack, in which people will go after their enemies before they can come after them. So by the time you get to the end of the 1530s, Luther has changed his position on violence on a number of key areas, moving first from the issue of no violence at all, then to the issue of repelling force with force, and then ultimately to the idea, at least with the door cracked, maybe not fully open, that a Christian may do violence. Now, the key issue here is that Luther has two orders of the idea of this violence. Luther actually will maintain that in our interpersonal lives, the furthest he will allow is repelling force with force. If someone attacks you, they attack your family, you may do violence, so to speak, against that person to repel them. However, Luther will never condone active violence in terms of our interpersonal lives together. He will, however, condone that type of violence at the order of the political state. Which is another way of saying, Philip of Hesse could not do violence for his own sake, personally. But if he's a German prince, and he's acting on behalf of God and Protestantism, then do all the violence that he wishes. So in the end, we can kind of sum it up this way. Luther was in favor of some pretty rigorous engagement of Christians in the political world, or of the political world in the lives of Christians. Even though he had this doctrine of two kingdoms, which purported to say that there was a separation between God's kingdom and the kingdoms of this world, he nevertheless believed that the fabric of society is unified, that people don't divide themselves up or compartmentalize themselves in a way that can separate their engagement with the political orders and their engagement with God. Many of his ideas about that political engagement, though, are really underdeveloped and immature. That is to say, he doesn't spend a lot of time dwelling on those issues. So it can be a challenge, frankly, to determine exactly what he believes at all levels. But again, we'll talk about this at the end of the course. We'll look at his doctrines in full. When it comes to violence, Luther has an evolving policy that is equally muddied at times, though he thinks it's clear depending on the circumstances. You or I, the most we can do is perhaps defend ourselves or our families. There is a repelling force with force that Luther admits into his political thinking at some point around 1530 or 1531 at the latest. The more troubling thing, though, is Luther does crack the door or leave the door open for active preemptive violence by Protestant rulers against Catholics. And you see, that issue will span the next 100 to 150 years as Germany and France and the Netherlands, England, and all these places get wrapped up in what's known as the Wars of Religion. Now, Luther is not the only Protestant to say this, but he is certainly one of the most vocal and by far the most influential. Okay, that's it. That is the context of Luther and his political ideas. In our next lecture, we're going to be looking at Luther and Melanchthon, Luther's right-hand man, his good little buddy, and we're going to look at some of the evolving issues between Luther and later Lutheranism.